Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Catherine Horton, and with me today is K3vin Annett, who will be reporting about the adventures that he has experienced in the last few weeks. I'm very, very excited to have him here, and many of you have heard that he has been kidnapped at the Canadian airport. And, I think this is something that has shocked a lot of people and has caused international outrage. And I've heard that he was freed eventually when, it took actually diplomatic pressure to get him freed. But K3vin, would you like to start off with telling us what happened and how it exactly went down?
I'd love to. Thanks for having me on again. I was attempting to cross over from Vermont in America over into Quebec. I had an interview scheduled at a Montreal television station, and this was in the morning. And what happened was I came in, normal procedure. It's called the Canadian Border Services Agency. And they looked at my passport, they ran it through the machine. And like what happened in England that time, the fellow behind the machine had a look of concern on his face, right? So he then asked me to go into the back room. And I sat there for about 15 minutes without him saying anything. He was looking at his computer again. And then he said, you'll have to stay here a minute. He went out and I sat for another 10 or 15 minutes. And then another fellow came in and said, I was being detained for questioning and examination. And I said, what kind of examination? And they said, we're not free to disclose that. And I said, well, then I'm not free to disclose anything to you unless you want to provide me with the chance to call a lawyer or whatever, right? So then he looked a bit bothered by that and he left. Sat around for another half an hour, and then three guys entered the room, like something out of a bad movie. They had, two of them had shades on. They were all in suits. They didn't present ID. They didn't say who they were. They said I was being detained under administrative detention laws. And I said to them, that wouldn't be Track B by any chance, would it? Because it's in government circles in Canada, they have this parallel system of administrative justice. It's kind of like Homeland Security in America, where you can be detained outside the court system. There's no habeas corpus, there's no due process. You're just detained indefinitely. And usually they reserve that for people who are considered a threat on a terrorist watch list. I know I'm not on that list. But anyway, they said, you're going to have to come with us. And I said, where? And they wouldn't answer. So I figured if I put up physical resistance, they'd use that against me. Because if you do that, if you show any kind of sign of violence or anything, they can classify you as, psychiatric risk and put you away for 72 plus hours for involuntary observation. So I didn't do anything that would kind of create that impression. I was very calm and rational. But I told them right away, I'm not answering your questions. I'm not cooperating because this is an illegal detention. I don't even know who you are. And we drove for about, I was in the back of a car, and it's kind of like, if you've ever been arrested in the back of a cop car, there are no door handles. You can't get out, right? Designed to make you feel powerless and insignificant. So they put me in there with one of them. The windows were blacked out, so I couldn't really see where we were going. But I could tell that now this was near Montreal, and we were driving in an area that wasn't urban. I think we drove in the direction of Ottawa, the nation's capital. I was taken into a facility. It was underground, a holding facility. And again, they tried to ask me questions, and I wouldn't answer. But the questions they asked were very interesting. The first question they asked was, are you still concerned about the British royal family? And I said, I'm not answering anything. Right? I just refused to talk about it. Right. And then they asked if I had intended to continue my campaign involving the church and the government. And again, I wouldn't answer. But it's interesting because those are under the fixated threat laws in England and Canada. Those are the grounds on which you can detain people indefinitely for so-called psychiatric exam for having a fixation. And I know it's connected to what had last happened to me in England when I was detained in 2011, because not only did they ask me similar questions, but at a protest we had held outside the Archbishop of Canterbury's palace in Lambeth Palace in London, a cop had come up to me, handed me a slip of paper and said, Mr. Annett, we've seen you at these protests before. This is a second warning, right? So it's a 3 strikes and you're out rule. If you're detained 3 times for this reason, they can hold you indefinitely. I knew that, and so I didn't give them anything. I just refused to answer anything. I was held overnight, and then very quickly I was let go. I was taken back to the airport and met up with friends and taken to a safe house after that, an ITCCS safe house, and gave a complete description to a lawyer who works for our tribunal now. He advised me not to go into any great detail because they're considering a lawsuit against the British Crown and the Canadian government. So there's certain things I didn't disclose right away, but that's basically what happened, you know.
This is absolutely mind-blowing because I have to say, I mean, first of all, let's just analyze all this. When they come in with the shades and it's an airport, it can't be just blinding sunshine, you know, when you're inside. So it's just all, it's kind of dominance displays and harassment theater. And you know, so already there you can see that it's a psyop. It's some sort of psychological game that they're playing. But the other thing that really interests me, which is because we know that this happens to a lot of people, and actually a lot of people we never hear about. They just disappear. So I'm very interested to find out more about Track B and how you found out about it. And also, you know, I also want to say, list all the measures that people can take, because you were detained at an airport and then you were escorted away by a nebulous group of people. You don't know who they are, but surely their faces must be on all the airport CCTV, and their car must have been registered by the cameras that are all around the airport. So no cars ever entering or leaving an airport without being, you know, noted. So surely the entire episode must have left some traces, and we can find out who exactly these people are.
And that's in fact what, in my debriefing with the lawyer, that's exactly what we talked about. And they've already made inquiries. Apparently what we found out so far is they were private contractors. Now that can be a lot of people, but somebody with money and influence hired them to do this. And whether it's the government, the Crown, whoever, right? It's, I just found it interesting that when I was threatened by Sasha Stone and Robert David Steele, they both made the claim that back in March that they intended to have me detained for questioning and evaluation to be removed from the public sphere. And then boom, it happens, right? So I don't believe that that's coincidental at all. And what was significant, though, is that this storm this raised, apparently not only was there people in Europe immediately on the case of the Canadian government, but at the UN, people who I didn't even know about raised in you know, human rights concerns of this with the Canadian delegation, and that's why I got out of there quick. That's why I was released so quickly. But it also gave encouragement to groups at the UN who were trying to have the Vatican expelled, and it's actually backfired on these people. So these are good things in the long run. They tend to backfire when they try to come down too heavy, you know.
I absolutely agree. And I think one of the tasks we have as the onlookers and in these situations when we're not directly involved is to make the backfiring come down on them even more powerfully and even more quickly. You know, the one thing I wanted to ask you about is the Track B. How did you find out about Track B, and what is Track B for those people who have never heard about it before?
It's a term used actually by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, which is like, they like to think of themselves as the Canadian equivalent of the CIA, right? The RCMP is domestic. CSIS works with overshore, like that group of 5 nations. I forget the term.
The Five Eyes.
The Five Eyes. Yeah, that's the Canadian equivalent. And I know this because there was a former CSIS agent who approached me in, it was right after our first court case. So it would have been about early 2013. And he had infiltrated what was called Piggy's Palace. There was a man called, who was brought to trial for killing Aboriginal women. Willie Picton, his name was. And he and his brothers ran this thing they called Piggy's Palace because it was a pig farm east of Vancouver where the remains of a lot of Aboriginal women were found. Now, this man, the CSIS agent, contacted me. We met downtown Vancouver, and he said that he had infiltrated this place because they had evidence that there were right-wing extremist groups operating out of it. He found that, in fact, the Picton brothers were only the body disposal crew. There was a much bigger network responsible for the torturing and killing and snuff filming of these women. It goes back many years. Picton was used as the Lee Harvey Oswald scapegoat. He has a substandard IQ, but somehow he masterminded this whole thing of killing and disposing of women. And no one has ever been allowed to interview him. He's just locked away in prison, right? And so Grant Wakefield, he went public after this, and he got targeted in a big way. The CSIS agent by the name of Grant Wakefield said that what they discovered was that there were former Canadian prime ministers, 2 serving Canadian senators, military people, 2 archbishops, Catholic archbishops, all involved in not only Piggy's Palace, but what is colloquially named the 12 Mile Club, which I've talked about before. It's that child sacrificial cult in Vancouver, referring to the 12-mile territorial limit. So they take children outside the 12-mile limit around Canada, dispose them after they've used them and killed them, dump them overboard. It's a whole network he discovered. Now, he got put through the ringer after that. He tried to, unfortunately, to use the Canadian court system to sue when there were, libel charges brought against him and everything. And of course, that's a dead end. It's a Crown-controlled system. So they tried to put him away in a psych ward for a while. The usual kind of thing you do to inconvenient whistleblowers. But anyway, in the course of Grant talking to me, he referred to this term Track B. And I said, well, is it like Homeland Security? And he said, it's worse. Because in America, there's the CIA there's formal oversight. The Congress formally has the power to, like they did in the 1970s when they discovered about the Iran-Contra, the illegal funding of the Contra war in El Salvador, and in Nicaragua. They cut off CIA funding for a while, which is why the CIA was bringing drugs in America to fund their illegal operations. So there's formal oversight. In Canada, there's no oversight. CSIS can release to the Attorney General, well, he's called the Solicitor General in Canada. They release to the Solicitor General whatever, any information they want to release, but they can withhold anything. They're like a self-governing society, so police agency. So Grant said, no, it's worse than Homeland Security. It's a parallel system of secret courts, going back to the system in medieval England, the Star Chamber courts, where the king could arrest anyone he wanted, hold them indefinitely. You couldn't see the evidence. You couldn't call witnesses. You couldn't call a lawyer. All of that. That's how Track B operates. And when I was talking to in the debriefing to the lawyer after, he made reference to the fact that you were definitely about to be put in the Track B system. And people go in there and literally are never seen again. So the problem with Canada is that it creates this liberal image of itself. And in fact, it's much more draconian, the system. As I brought forward when we brought out all the evidence of genocide, how it went on for so many years in the Indian schools, because, people are put away when they start talking about these things. You never hear about them from them again. So anyway, kind of in a nutshell, that's what I learned, and from other sources too, and people who've gone through it.
Sorry, my microphone stalled. I just have a couple of points. As you were talking, I have a lot of questions actually, but one point I would like to make for the people in Europe who are watching, there's one reference I want to give people about the 12 Mile Club. Because as you were talking, an entire, shower of associations was just coming over me. And one of the things is when you mentioned the 12 Mile Club about people taking children outside the 12-mile territorial limit to murder them, there's a very, very famous and important reference about that, which concerns the known sadistic pedophile and, I think child killer, Edward Heath. Okay, and this is just a footnote I would like to put in so that people can have a look and actually see that this is not just Canada, this is not just North America, this is here in Europe. And I would like to point people to this article here by, this is now the Daily Mirror, but there are many reports in the mainstream press. And this, quote says it all. 11 boys went out on Edward Heath's yacht, but I counted only 10 who left his boat. So when they returned, claims mom. So Edward Heath, I think somewhere here, there's a photograph of him on the boat, but he was involved in horrific pedophilia, and I think also child murder. And from what you describe, I would conclude that Edward Heath was part of the 12-mile club. I mean, for sure, right? And that again connects. It's, after all, it's a crown system. So Canada is a crown colony for all intents and purposes. So any system that would be practiced over there in North America would be practiced in Britain as the mother country, the mothership.
And another example of that was when Louis Mountbatten was blown up in 1979 in Donegal Bay off the Irish coast. He was on his private yacht. They blamed it on the IRA. In fact, Mountbatten was named by Tos Nienhuis and others who were in the Ninth Circle cult raised as children, that she was often taken to Mountbatten's castle in Ireland. And there were children on the boat with them when the boat was blown up. And we don't know exactly who did it. The IRA disclaimed responsibility, but I think it had to do with the same thing. The use of yachts is really common. You see, there was a place in Vancouver, it's still there, it's called the Vancouver Club. It's a very elite establishment. You have to be invited to become a member, but all the top elite are members. And we had continual reports from Native people of children being taken off Indian reservations into the back door of the Vancouver Club. There was a Native reporter, Noel Harrison, who had followed one of these limousines that were bringing kids from the Squamish Indian Reservation. He went in and these kids were released at 5 a.m. on the street. And he tried interviewing one of them and he was hit from behind and his tape recorder taken away. That was in 1998. And after we brought this stuff out at our tribunal, the first tribunal into residential schools the same year, the Vancouver Club, the judges who were members of that club brought in a media ban on any discussion of the Vancouver Club. Next thing we know, we're hearing tales of these yachts. So I think they shifted the operations at that point into this 12-mile club, like off the coast. So that shows you how it works. And related to that, there's a very important thing happening in July in Vancouver. The Anglican Church is having their 42nd General Synod from July 10th to 16th. Like, why does it take a week to hold a church gathering? They're holding it at the most expensive hotel. It's $2,000 a night suites. So this is not for ordinary Anglican people, right? We have it from sources that it's in fact a gathering of Ninth Circle people from all over the world. We know that the Catholic Church is sending Archbishop Michael Miller, who's already named as a 12-mile club member, to this gathering. And right where it's being held, it's just up the street from the Vancouver Club. We know there's a whole network of tunnels under that. And we believe that's where these sacrificial rituals will take place, probably midnight, July 16th, which is a full moon. There's going to be Native people protesting at this thing and that. But it shows you it's in Vancouver, I believe, is more and more a hotspot for this stuff. For reasons we can get into, but it shows you the continuity of the stuff, and I think it's not unrelated to what happened to me at the airport.
I think it's absolutely related to what happened to you at the airport, and I actually want to return to that. I just have a couple of footnotes that I want to put in for people to continue their research. Number one is that there were statements that at some point there was some regulation brought in the US that, as you pointed out, stifled the CIA. And I remember in one interview, somebody pointed out that all the assassins and all these, psychopaths, when the CIA started being regulated, went just across into Canada to continue their work. So there are statements from insiders about an influx into Canada about the worst type of mercenaries that you can imagine. So that certainly backs up what you're saying.
We have a lot of examples of that. There was one of a Native woman who discovered a child trafficking network in a place called Powell River, which is right on Vancouver Island, well, the mainland of Vancouver, but right on the coast, mainland of British Columbia, up the coast from Vancouver. And they found that there were South African mercenaries, Chinese military people, others who were bringing in children through these ports, because ports are a commonplace for this to happen. And Canada, especially the West Coast, it's why there was so much genocide there. You can make people disappear up these coasts, these coves, very secluded areas. So it's possible to do anything there. So yeah, definitely, there's lots of evidence of that. I would also direct people to murderbydecree.com, which is our online book. Section 3 talks about the ongoing genocide. We talk about a lot of this stuff in there that I've mentioned.
Yeah, I find it so important that you mention it and keep mentioning it, and that we relate it to what's going on now, because stuff that places where you could do this 10 or 20 years ago are places where you can still do it today. Yeah. And I think at some point they set up their networks, they have their tunnel networks. And actually, just again as another footnote, in the children's TV series called Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events, in every episode, they talk about one aspect of the cartel, almost teaching children about how the system works. And they have one very prominent one about tunnels. And tunnels feature, all the time. There was also the Playboy mention where they found tunnels connecting, celebrities and Hollywood actors, by a very intricate system of tunnels to the Playboy mansion. And one can just imagine what was going on at these places. The other thing I also found very interesting in your report about your kidnap is that you were held at an underground facility.
Right.
Did you have any idea how big that place was?
We drove, just before we went on an angle. We were driving underground. I know that. And I have no idea. I heard voices in there. I even heard somebody yelling at one point. So I believe there are other people detained there. And, there's a number of possible sites around Ottawa, where that could have happened, but definitely had the feel of military.
Yeah. I mean, the scary thing is, and this is what people always ignore, is that when we think about these places, people think about military installations or something that is somehow secluded. But frankly, it could be even an underground car park under a Walmart, and scarily enough, what I found circumstantial evidence for is that a lot of otherwise innocuous places are used for the darkest things, underground, simply because they're labeled as something else. You would never think, okay, there's an Intersport or, something like a Walmart, and actually underground, you have a big CIA facility torturing and raping people.
Right. Yeah.
This is just absolutely scary. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I remember last time we did an interview, you mentioned that there was a very big thing happening in April in Europe. So can you tell us more about that and how that went down?
It happened during Easter week, the 14th to the 21st of April. And this was in the process of being organized for about 2 or 3 months. It consisted of the usual gamut of direct actions at churches. It was quite successful, actually. There was a real peak in the number of protests. There was attempted citizen arrests against known people. I call them the dirty 30, the original 30 defendants in the common law court case we did that forced Pope Benedict to resign. Also during that week, it was interesting because it was so high profile. We were recontacted by people at the UN, which I mentioned earlier. These are people who, for a while, had been trying to get the credentials of the Vatican removed, because that's called the Holy See. It's their administrative diplomatic arm. Basically, the Vatican invited itself into the General Assembly in 1964. It just showed up one day with a diplomatic team, and U Thant, the Secretary General, allowed them to do it without even taking a vote. Now, to become a member, you have to pass what's called the state qualification test. There's 4 criteria of being a state under something called the Montevideo Conference of 1933. And you have to have like a permanent territory, a permanent population, the ability to enter into diplomatic relations, and an actual government. Well, on all 4 counts, the Vatican doesn't meet any of those criteria. It's a religion. The Vatican is a palace, 108 acres in downtown Rome. You can't have a state within a city within another state. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense, right? And yet they're functioning like a government. And so they've been able to sit on UN committees. They block human rights conventions. They refer to any form of birth control as abortion. So they block moves to provide cheap and accessible birth control in poverty-stricken areas in Africa. They block from the International Criminal Code Convention. They restrict the definition of persecution to only men and women. So if you're gay, you have to be a male or female. You can't be transgendered. You can't have another sexual orientation, or you're not covered by ICC convention. All of that is a result of the Vatican. And what's even worse is they are signatories to the Convention on Torture and the Rights of the Child, and yet they're not enforcing those conventions. They're trafficking children. They're responsible for the torture and death. So how is it that a member state can be violating a convention and yet be a party to it and never be held accountable? So they're like a state within a state. They're like a power within the UN that's totally unaccountable, and no other member is allowed to do that, but the Vatican is. So people are finding this very outrageous. And now that the atmosphere has changed so that a lot of these crimes in the Catholic Church are talked about now, they feel that now's the time to make a move. And July 1st, there's going to be an action outside the UN General Assembly. There's other things being planned, but they're going to make a formal petition to the various bodies, Security Council and others, to expel the Vatican. And not only that, but try to enforce the criminal charges, the verdicts brought against them by the Common Law Court, because the verdict of the Common Law Court that forced Ratzinger to resign has lawful standing under law. So other courts can issue, and as a matter of fact, the International Criminal Court is obligated to enforce the verdict involving crimes against humanity, but they refuse to do so. So this is showing, and I think this is one of the reasons the UN people are realizing they have to move on this, because they're looking so bad. The ICC and the UN is openly colluding in crimes against humanity by protecting the Vatican, and they have to find some way to separate themselves. And now maybe my arrest, maybe this stuff is being a trigger for that. I'd like to think so, but they seem to be moving more on that now. So it should be really interesting what happens, right?
I think your arrest can actually be the trigger and the catalyst, and it should be, because so much gets unraveled in this entire procedure. Because yeah. I don't think that it was just Canada having an interest in this. The question that you were asked about the royal family connects it straight to what I call the crown colony of the United Kingdom, which again is a colony of the Vatican. Actually, the Vatican turning up just out of nowhere, moving in with their people and just, appearing at the table, to me shows that they are originally the superstructure above the UN. Only if you are the boss of an event can you turn up, and without being invited and without being voted for. So don't you agree that actually shows that originally the UN is a Vatican invention and construct?
I think that's a lot of evidence to that effect, because how else could they get away with that? How would the UN possibly justify allowing one of their members to openly violate the principles, the conventions of the UN, and get away with it for so many years? And to be financially subsidized by all these governments through these financial concordats, which funnel taxpayers' money of over 100 nations right into the Vatican Bank. So, yeah, you follow the money like we always talk about, right? Follow those banks, follow the money. And, yeah, I think that's very credible.
Yeah, all paths lead to Rome, So I actually think what I'm trying to do here is I also would like to emphasize to all the viewers that you have to get behind these investigations. You have to get behind K3vin Annett. And should, people like K3vin disappear and suddenly not, report publicly, you have to put pressure on your government and your authorities to make this happen. The other point I want to make is that even if the UN was designed by the Vatican and this global crime cartel, it doesn't mean that the system has to be governed by them. I think we can recapture the system and make it our own. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, but it's got to happen from the grassroots, because like we find when I work with a lot of people, they try to use the existing courts and government, and it's almost designed to drain people's energy. And even if you do get a temporary victory, it's always very conditional. Like Native people in Canada, yeah, they got some compensation money, a whopping $10,000, you're allowed for a lifetime of misery after being tortured in these places. But they had to sign off all legal action, and they absolved the people responsible. So it is the best you can hope for is a bit of blood money and a gag order. That's not justice, right? So we have to create that justice. That's the whole idea about behind the common law courts, right?
Absolutely. And actually, on that point, I would like to say that any sort of gag order and any contract related to this sort of blood money and shutting people up, I think that should be considered an unconscionable contract, even in contract law, because what you're trying to buy is people's silence so that the psychopaths and serial killers can continue murdering other people by being left free.
That's perfectly right. And it goes even further under the law because everything is based on contract. And there's a saying in the law, fraud vitiates or nullifies all agreements. If you've been party to a contract, you defrauded somebody, well, you can't use coercion to force somebody into a contract. And yet all of these settlements with survivors are all based on coercion. You accept this money or you might go to jail or you might not get any recognition or, you know, all the family are pressuring them to take the money and shut up. That's totally illegitimate in contract law to force somebody into an agreement that way. So it's astounding what the system gets away with. And it's only because people feel they don't have alternatives, right? And we got to create those, like Sam Adams said in the American Revolution, it doesn't take a majority to prevail. Only a minority of people determined to light brush fires of freedom in the minds of men and women. And that's exactly what we do. We light that brush fire of freedom and people can take action for themselves and say, to hell with this whole rotten system. You know, we can act in our own name now. And that's really our guiding spirit of a lot of what we do.
You know, on this topic, talking about the very precise action of gagging these survivors, I think maybe one idea would be to tell them, well, you know, you took the money, that's okay, but that's not all you can get. I mean, frankly, $10,000 are just peanuts. It's actually an insult, a denigrating insult to these people. So I would say take the money and then go back to a common law court and nullify the gag order and go back for more. This is what I would say.
Yes. Exactly. It's like when people threaten to sue me, I say, well, go ahead and sue. Let's go into court. Let's go into examination. I love it, right? But nobody, unfortunately, has ever sued me. But on that point, it gets even worse. If you were a Native person in one of these death camps and you were seeking compensation, you had to appear before a panel who would grill you and say, well, wasn't it your own father who raped you? Aren't you blaming the church for something that happened at home? They were given points depending on the torture they suffered. So the lawyers call it a meat chart. So if you were anally raped, that isn't as bad as being frontally raped, and you got only 5 points, right? So they categorize pain, and depending on the number of points you can get even less than $10,000. I've met people who got $3,000-$4,000, and they had to sit in front and experience the trauma. I mean, that's designed to break people, right? For a few measly dollars in order to absolve the perpetrators. I mean, it's criminal. This cover-up has been just as criminal as the original atrocities.
Well, you know, one of the things that I keep thinking in terms of the law, given that we're dealing with crimes against humanity, there is no limitation period, which means that whatever shenanigans went down, we can re-examine it and re-examine it. And I think at this point, when you have actually a panel conduct something quite so psychopathic and torturous, at this stage, now that we learn more and more about the crime cartel, I think it is incumbent on us and on everybody to educate themselves and then go back and say, actually, this panel, let's examine who was on the panel, who was suggesting such psychopathic torture, and let's put it into context, because frankly, if I compare $10,000 to what the average gang stalker who is conducting psychological terrorism on somebody today in the streets of America and Canada and in Europe is getting per year, I think we'll realize that 10,000 is piffle, given that this system is printing money, right? So yeah. I think it's an insult. So we should go back and say, okay, who exactly were the panel? What are their control files? And what can we find out about them, you know?
The churches who did the crime got to appoint the commissioners on the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's like the serial killer appointing their own jury.
Yeah.
And the commissioners were not allowed to take down as evidence any reference to a capital crime, a killing, anything that falls in criminal law. They could hear it, but they weren't allowed to take it down as evidence. So what kind of report are you going to get if you're not even allowed to talk about crime? And they got to look through the statement of the survivor and censor it beforehand. Like, none of this was ever mentioned in the Canadian media. It's right there in the rules of the TRC mandate, section 2 of their mandate. It said all that. And yet it's like the imaginary, Santa Claus. Like, everyone pretends to believe in this thing, that there's justice going on, and it's nonsense. It was a obstruction of justice, and another crime, really. All of this stuff is.
Yeah, when I listen to this, and I really appreciate that you have all this detailed knowledge, because for outsiders, we wouldn't even know where to look for this information, but you exactly know off by heart the precise points of where the fraud was committed. And I think what we need is all the viewers to go back and go to murderbydecree.com, educate them, look at all your past interviews that you've already put out. And I think at some point we have to re-examine this entire Truth and Reconciliation. And I also want to point out that similar shit, the same Illuminati template, has been pulled on South Africa, where they also had the same Truth and Reconciliation nonsense go down. Yeah. And what is typical is that you have the most horrific crimes, which in standard criminal law, things like murder, would get you life in jail. And when you have the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, you don't just have murder, you have genocide, and nothing happens. People are given a lollipop and a kiss on the cheek.
The mere fact that the government and churches set it up and validated it, because under international law, when you're party to a crime, you can't dictate the terms of compensation, justice, reparations, any of that. And the minute you do, you're obstructing justice. So, another point is, at the TRC in Canada, unlike the one in South Africa where they granted immunity for people in return for their testimony, there's no immunity granted. So if you're a Native person giving a testimony, you can get sued for what you say. You're standing up in front of your torturers and rapists, and at any point you know that they can go after you for anything you say. Like, that is absurd. How can you operate any kind of... That in itself should have disqualified the entire thing legally and morally in Canada.
I think it should. And I think, frankly, I'm very pleased because American investigators are now using the expression lawfare for legal warfare. And for me, lawfare falls under a big umbrella of administrative terrorism. And I think at some point we should start putting out this term of administrative terrorism, using administrative procedures to destroy people's lives, and actually start going after administrative terrorists. These are the people who sit in on judicial panels. And for example, there's the Bioethics Committee in the United States who has rubber stamped and covered up the horrific torture and mutilation of Americans that continues to this day. So I think we should bundle all of these people. And when we look at how many people sat on these committees, I think we should bring criminal charges against them and open that up, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the way it starts, people, it's kind of like looking at this huge system and saying, how can I take it on? But it starts in a very simple way, like we did in Canada. You go, like Sun Tzu says in The Art of War, you threaten what your enemy loves. And what do these people love? Their public image and their money. So that's what you threaten. That's why when we started occupying churches, threatening the collection plate, they had to respond. The public image of these people, they're so vulnerable, I find, as individuals. When you find out where these judges or these politicians live and you go knock on their door, they freak out because they think they're protected by the system. Yet, no, you're just a man or a woman, and you're accountable, right? You are accountable for everything you do and say, and you use those tactics, and it's amazing the response you get. Just forming your own neighborhood inquiry. I did this in Dublin last year. We formed a common law assembly. We had 12 people sign a charter. And it gave them the right to hold an assembly, appoint community sheriffs to protect the community, try to deputize the police to become part of this assembly. It's people reinventing their country from the grassroots. And you can launch your own inquiries. You can do your own investigations. And that's the source of our power, because we keep control of it. We know it's an honest verdict and evidence because we control it. It isn't some whitewash happening through the government or the perpetrators. So that's what I really recommend. And that's some of my books that you can get at Amazon. The Common Law Training Manual, the Whistleblower Manual, all of that, just put in my name and you'll see all the goodies.
Well, actually, talking about that, I've got your books right here because they're on my desk. Okay, they're on my desk. So, people, this was I think, the first edition, the Common Law Training Manual, and I
Yeah,
think last time you told me
yeah,
that
that's the one I got, yeah.
this blue book is the updated version, and this is the I think, the Establishing the Reign of Natural Liberty, a Common Law Training Manual, and I
Yeah,
bought both, but I think this is the newer version, right?
it is. That's the one to get. And I had the most fun writing this, the Truth Teller's Shield,
Oh
because
yeah,
I filtered out a lot of my experience. I just summarized it, and it's how you survive these attacks. The power we have that we don't realize we have, uh, and how to navigate their psychological warfare that you were referring to, that which is all based on trying to get us afraid, doubting ourselves, you know. And really, they're just like the little man behind the big mask. You just have to pull the mask back, right?
absolutely. The other thing I meant to ask you is when you mentioned this the setting up the common law tribunals in Dublin and deputizing the police. Are there any internet reports about that people can have a look at to get a feel for what you did? Were there any interviews that people could look at?
Well, when we do that work, we tend to stay off the media radar. Uh,
Okay.
we're doing a lot of grassroots community organizing, but there was a thing in Dublin called Take Back the City, which is all over the media. They're the ones who, when Bergoglio, Pope Francis, went to Ireland, only 1 in 20 people showed up at these events he was going to hold. And there was thousands of people protesting him in the streets. Well, that was organized by Take Back the City, in which a number of our people were active. And I remember one day when I was meeting with the folks in Dublin, I was staying at the home of this woman, and she got a phone call. And the police were about to start busting heads in this building that a lot of homeless families had gone in and occupied, because they were starving, literally. They were on the street. And so they went in. And Mary Kelly, this older woman, went and she stood in the face of the police and said, "We've got 100 witnesses here. You better not touch these people," right? And sure enough, they backed off. And not only that, but the Gardaí, that's the name of the Irish police, a police inspector came by later, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to take up a collection. All the cops here have to put in to this collection to pay rent for these people or put them in a hotel. We just want to get rid of this problem." So the police start passing the hat to raise money for these people. It shows you, like, these people are just men and women like you and I, right? And they have a conscience, and you can reach the high. If you keep the moral high ground, you can reach the hearts and minds of anyone. And that's what they're afraid of, that we're beginning to do that, right? And you can feel it's like in a revolution, the army switches sides, right? That's when the regime topples. And I see that more and more. Like, I see police really questioning what they're doing, but they need the alternative, which is why we need these common law systems in place, right?
Absolutely. I mean, also on a personal note, one way where people manage to win over the police, and I'm talking about the victims who are being assaulted with direct energy weapons and are, implanted and being tortured, is to tell the police that they too are implanted. Actually, the police were the first everywhere in Europe and the US and the West to be implanted, and they are hooked up to a system called Tetra in the United Kingdom. And so if you're in Ireland, where I'm pretty sure they're using the same system, just tell them, "Oh, by the way, you're also implanted. So you should put a ring detector to the neck.
That's really important, Catherine. I agree with you, reaching those people and say, you're the guinea pigs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I think what people don't realize when they are working for a government office or the police force, especially soldiers and intelligence officers, is that they are actually property of the crown. This is how the Vatican typically looked at them, as their private property. They were the cattle of the first line to be experimented on, because they were, so close to the system. They could be observed. So I think this is such valuable work that you're doing, recapturing all these systems. And I really like the entire approach. And I think it should be pointed out that when you win over the police and you bring them on the side of the population, it's actually a real revolution, because historically the police force was set up by the establishment to protect them from the people, right? I mean, it's really unprecedented.
Exactly. Ultimately, unless it's a professional army, most armies are just conscripts. And that's why they're unstable in a time of social upheaval. You need an elite force that's going to protect the rich elites, right? And so, yeah, that's a very good point.
Now that you mention that, I mean, this is a very, very good point. And isn't it the case that the US has been importing, for example, UN tanks, from abroad? Isn't that a sign that there were generals who were complaining about the fact that all the soldiers are on social media and they get to the truth, so they can't be blackmailed and brainwashed by the generals, right?
Well, I do know, working with people in America, that what you see a lot of private mercenary armies. Like we heard about Blackwater. They went to work. Monsanto company actually hired them as their own private army. But you see it more and more. The police forces are all privatized. The TSA, Transit Security Administration in America, these are the guys at all the airports. Over half of them don't even work for the government. They work for General Dynamics Corporation, one of the biggest military contractors in the country. So whenever I go through U.S. security, I say to a TSA person, do you work for General Dynamics or the government? And then one guy said, I can't tell you. But they get all nervous because they know that you know, right? And they're obviously being told not to talk about who they really work for, right? Because then the mask slips a bit more, right?
You know, the other thing that's very important to put in as a footnote, now that you mention this, Catherine Austin Fitz gave an interview to Greg Hunter, and she was, I think, the first person to point out that there has been some new financial regulation brought in the US, and it's called FASB, I think FASAB or something like that, 56. And what that allows is for Black funds to be set up everywhere, and it allows for Black budgets to just pull as much money from the US government as they want with absolutely zero oversight. So it's endless money for private armies, as she called it. And she said as soon as this regulation was signed in, Blackwater put out an advert saying Blackwater is coming. So I think what you're seeing is the government being taken over by these private mercenary armies more and more if you don't stop them.
Well, that's what we mean when we call the global system now a corporatocracy. You know, the government, elections, all that, it's just a hand puppet everybody watches, but the real process is what you're talking about and what I experienced in the Track B system.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So we live in a police state, right? That's the first thing people need to know, and because that determines your actions. If you don't know what you're in, you can keep banging your head against the wall or not realize the nature of your opponent, right? So we have to make that clear to people.
And what would you say, what should people do to either wake up, and also the next step, what exactly should they do day to day or, in 2019 to help you and to actually get out of this and back to sanity and a functioning government?
Well, all our strength is local. It's in grassroots. It's in meeting people. I was talking to a man in Michigan who's starting a whole movement to get their Catholic priest to leave, to cut off ties with Rome. Like this group in Not in Our Name in Ireland, priests there, they're just trying to do the same thing. He said over the phone, he said to me, how can I trust you? Because I've heard a lot of things about you. And I said, you only trust a person when you meet them and you sense their energy and you look at their evidence and you look at what they've gone through. And then you use your common sense reason. And it starts as simply as that with each one of us. We've got to reclaim that because we've been raised to think somebody else has the authority to speak for us. Somebody else understands things better than us. No, we are our own best teachers because we know our own experience. So trust that, trust yourself, and know what you have to do based on that. At that point, a lot of the work I do is I just go into communities and organize common law training workshops, give talks. In the fall, in September, I'm starting that up again in a big way because that's when the campuses are open. And, I'll be doing all over North America and Europe again. And hope to meet you finally.
I actually, you know what, this is the first thing that I was thinking when you were saying that. I was like, oh my God, are you coming to Europe? Because I want to attend. Yeah. I want to get back there.
You and I should go on the road on a speaking tour, Catherine.
Yeah, no, really, I think you should, because there's such a potential. And one of the things I was thinking, and I also want to canvass our viewers if they would be interested, is to put up touring conferences where people can meet all these, the people who they otherwise would only meet over YouTube, and maybe use that to crowdfund, because we can put out this, on YouTube, but if you can fill a hall, maybe people can come together, meet each other as well. And I think there's so much work that can be done when you're meeting face to face,
Excellent. We should work on that because, our funding, our communications have been really attacked over the last few
Yeah.
months. We'll set up a GoFundMe site and then they'll never forward the money to us.
Yeah.
Just continual interference. So we need those things on the ground to help us. And, I just urge people to, like you say, go to murderbydecree.com. I'm at thecommonland@gmail.com. Just write me. And, we'll set up whatever we need to in your community, right?
Well, also the time scale is just perfect because I am one of those people who I had a kind of mixed bag of an experience with the High Court in London. I had three judges that I stood before pro se, and two of them were amazing. I think they were very good. They were supporting my litigation, even though it was in such a shoddy state. They could have blown me out the door, but they didn't. And actually MI5 planted a very grumpy person. I was totally alone in the room when I walked in. I was the only person before the judge, and when I left there were two people, one person transcribing and somebody who was the grumpiest person I think they had at MI5 that day, and they just put this person there to just glare at the judge. And I could see that the judge was getting increasingly uncomfortable, and I didn't know why. And then I saw Mr. Grumpy, and I was like, oh my God, he's got a face like, 3 weeks rain in Cornwall. And despite this, the judge actually stared down the threatening person and continued my litigation. And then the third person, blew it up. So what I wanted to say is I'm going back into the court and trying my luck. But should that fail, literally the only option that victims of this ongoing Holocaust have is to follow your common law model. And then we have, in the autumn, we have to hit the university courses. We have to hit your course, and we have to learn how to do this, because otherwise we're screwed.
Absolutely. And that's a great plan. And I think that we need to operate a parallel system all the time.
Yeah.
So that as soon as it doesn't work, that other alternative is there to step in. And I tell you, it embarrasses them a lot when they know that we are watching you and we are documenting with our own record what's going on. That gets criminals very worried when you do that, right?
Yeah, and then imagine that system whereby you can have a court case that goes bottom up in the usually corrupt way, as my third court hearing went. And then you can come out of the court hearing and you can just go straight the next day into another court and rectify it all in front of your peers.
Yep, exactly.
What are the prerequisites that you would want your prospective students of your course in the autumn to actually know when they enter your lectures and your presentations?
Something about my own personal history, not what they read on the internet, but the actual documented history. I've recently, I constantly write books. It's a nervous habit, but the two most recent books I've written, At the Mouth of a Cannon, which tells the issue that got me fired, but led to this whole campaign, about what I call the octopus of corporation, church, and state that was responsible for a lot of these crimes originally and still is. But then the other one I wrote a book called The Border, and it gives a lot of personal disclosure about what led me into doing this. And I use the border as a metaphor because I'm half American. My dad's a Yank. My mom's Canadian, right? And I had this experience growing up of being able to really see both cultures and how different they are, right? And I don't know. It's like if people read more the human side of me, I think they'll understand where I'm coming from on this. And never believe what you hear about somebody, right? Just talk to them. But of course, the basic book is the murderbydecree.com. This is the actual book. It's got the hard evidence and, the history of how this came about. People need to have that education before they can listen knowledgeably to really what led us to this, because it's like the movement for the Republic of Kanata in Canada that grew out of this. People realized, I don't want to live under Crown authority after they committed these crimes. I'm obligated under international law not to. We need an alternative. And that's what led to this common law movement. We don't want to live under a genocidal system anymore. We can't, under international law, associate with a criminal system. And there's a lot of precedents for that, right, in the law. So anyway, one thing leads to another, and people should be aware of that, all of that. Otherwise, you kind of, you deal off innuendo and rumor about somebody and your own kind of fears. What's this white guy doing? Like, who is he really, right? You get that, but knowledge is power.
Absolutely, and I think that is dissipating fast. I think actually the entire ITNJ and Robert David Steele action totally misfired. I think much worse than they could have ever imagined. And every single time you have a cycle of doubt, when people go out and do their research and they see both sides, you actually it's like a ratchet action. You get to a better informed audience who have gone through this cycle of doubt, investigation, looking at the evidence, and then deciding either way. And the people who then stick to you, they are, inoculated against this sort of nonsense, and they
Right.
know what they should focus on.
That's a very good image, like of how we deal with the whole thing, because smear campaigns backfire. They're only good in the short run. In the long run, they bring more attention. And they say, well, why is this guy being at it for 25 years on an unpaid basis? Unless he was legitimate, because if he was an opportunist, he would have dropped out years ago as soon as the shit came down, right? And so it's proved in practice, right? Who we are is proved in practice. But you have to know what the practice is. You have to know the whole story, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what will also, I unfortunately help, is that people will experience a form of targeting the way we experience it over the coming years, in one form or another. And when you know what it's like to be hit by this genocidal system, as you accurately described it, in the face on your own life, and how that rips apart your marriage. I mean, mine was totally destroyed, and how it rips apart your life, then you begin to understand what it takes to actually persevere in the tasks that you're doing, Kevin. I think that is something that more and more people, unfortunately, will learn to appreciate, because they will be hit hard by this entire system, sadly.
Well, I mean, yeah, and just 2 points on that. We only discover our real nature and strength once we're under the gun. I know that. And we have so much more strength and integrity than we realize in so-called normal times. And so conditions of war, which is what we're in, conditions of war bring out that heroism. And an example of why we need to do this, I don't know if you followed this news item last month in Rockland County, which is just west of New York City. A city council commissioner announces that all children have to be vaccinated. And if they aren't vaccinated, their parents will go to jail for 6 months. And they have to be kept off the street if they're not vaccinated, right? And fortunately, some parents got together and they got a district judge to overturn that. But then 2 days later, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, announces the same thing for Brooklyn. Everyone in Brooklyn has to be vaccinated. Well, Big Pharma is obviously pulling this guy's string, but it's absurd. I mean, you can imagine saying to your child, you can't walk out on the street today and get until you get the shot, or otherwise mommy will go to jail. I mean, it's abominable. And when those things happen, people wake up, hey, this can happen to any of us now. And it is happening to us, right?
Absolutely. And I think for those people, because I have a lot of, I was trying to raise attention in the medical community, and I found that a lot of doctors are, partly because they're so overworked, they didn't have time to go on Facebook or alternative media. They still live in the old, paradigm that they think, oh, vaccinations are great. And I come from a region where without vaccinations, you could have died the most horrific death. So there's one basis vaccination you need for, to guard against evil. But what we're talking about is all the other shit that they put into the vaccinations, piggybacking on the fact that you need it for survival in certain regions, to then put in the genocide mechanisms, things like nanotech, mercury, a bunch of other things, foreign DNA, to then do really horrific things and experiment on your children. And this is what we're talking about. And there are more and more doctors saying this is horrific, And actually, one of the things that as a scientist I would like to point out is that look at the number of cases they use as a pivot point to bring about this. Because typically it's things like, oh, there were 8 measles cases. I mean, over a population. Yeah. This is a freaking joke, 8 measles cases. That's what we had in my primary school, and nobody died.
Well, it's not a lethal disease either. Like measles, like anyway, it doesn't. It's got corporate agenda written all over it. So
it absolutely has. So, Kevin, what would you like us to do this week and this year to help you? What are the most useful things to you? And do you have some sort, because you also mentioned finances, what is the best way to support you financially and your movement?
Murderbydecree.com, there's a little thing in the masthead that says donate. And there's two ways to donate there. I prefer the PayPal system that's there because it's the easiest to access. The best thing people can do is order my books at Amazon.com, Kevin Annett, Annett, and go to murderbydecree.com and educate yourself. Contact me. That's the most important thing. We need the human contact. And I would say if you're in an area, of course, you're going to be in an area where there's a Catholic church, start your own local campaign, because this is a criminal body. It's trafficking children all over the world. You're obligated to help that if you're a Catholic under the Crimen Solicitatis policy. So start a movement, because that's a common denominator linking everybody. The Catholic Church is everywhere. That's the thing that can unite our actions. And I would say contact me and we can get you in touch with the nearest convener of our campaign. And especially going into the summer and the fall, where we need to support that move at the UN to get the Vatican thrown out and to get the tax-exempt status canceled. That's another kind of thing we did during April. We started a campaign to get governments to actually cancel tax-exempt status for these genocidal churches. We're even going to the insurance companies that underwrite them and saying, you know, you can't underwrite a convicted criminal society that makes you an accessory.
Oh, very good. I love that.
Insurance coverage, goodbye. You know, so we got to use all these tactics. And so,
you know what? This is brilliant. I've just heard 2 days ago that somebody pointed out, I think it was a microwave weapon expert, actually. I think of the name Flynn, Jeremy Flynn. He gave an interview and he pointed out that insurance companies refuse to underwrite anything to do with microwaves, with microwave communication. And that's because they know this is causing horrific harm and they don't want to be held liable. Right. So if you use the insurance mechanism, you're actually tapping into one of the major sources of income for the mafia, which traditionally has been working in insurance, you know.
And they're tied in so closely with the Vatican and the Vatican Bank. I read a news item last month that said some of the insurance underwriters of the Catholic Church in America have withdrawn their coverage because they didn't realize, till some of our people notified them of this, that there's a standing policy of crimen solicitatis where secrecy is at work. You're not to talk about child rape. Well, the insurance company says, we can't insure people who have a policy of in-house secrecy, right? Because that's a crime. We can't. Okay, so the very Vatican policy is screwing them with their insurance covers, but not enough people know about that. So that could be their Achilles. I know that's their Achilles heel, right? The money. And their liability. That's these guys. Having taken these church officials on, I know there's one thing they worry about: whether they're going to lose their shirt personally, whether they're going to have their house taken in a lawsuit, right? So that's what you strike at.
Well, this is absolutely beautiful. I mean, also the other thing is that this is when the snake bites itself in the tail, in the exact precise Vatican, symbolism, because actually AXA is one of these Vatican Crown Corporation top companies. And I think a while ago, I showed the network of global corporate control and the major companies that control this. And at the very top, you have banks, but also insurance companies for precisely this reason that you could launder so much money through insurance, traditionally. And by getting the insurance to detach from the Vatican, you literally just break up this crime cartel of just, greedy criminals. This is beautiful. But
that's
also,
just a little point. I found out the other day that the word Vatican comes from an Etruscan word, which means divining serpent.
That is exactly. I mean, this is probably why they use it as a logo, everywhere. The other thing that occurred to me is that if you can't insure a corporation with in-house secrecy, you probably can't give any life insurance to MI6 agents and CIA agents, right?
The sky's the limit on this stuff, Catherine. That's the Achilles heel of their system: money and protection, security, right? So
yeah. No,
they're more valuable than we are. That's what I always think to people. They've got a lot more to lose than I do. What else can they do? Take my life, fine. But
I mean, that's the thing, when you're in a situation like you and I, our lives are so cheap. They're just peanuts, to these people. But they are so high up. They have a long way to fall. This is what I want them to remind themselves of.
Yep.
This is absolutely beautiful. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, you also mentioned that in the broadcast that there's a schedule of these satanic rituals when is the next one coming up, and when do people have to get, when do they have to start campaigning to avert the next ritual sacrifice?
Well, summer solstice is always the big one, of course, June 21st, 22nd. And the 21st to 23rd in the month is always a high point in Vatican satanic.
Is that every month?
Yeah. Now, another one we know of is the one on July 16th, the Anglican Synod in Vancouver, Canada. The thing is that there's not only general satanic dates, but there's also specific ones that these local covens use to throw people off, right? I mean, some of them hold them every full moon. There isn't one standard. I mean, there's a lot of variation we found, but there are definitely high points. And some coming up, summer solstice is a big one.
The other thing that kept playing on my mind since our last interview is at what point can we get the frickin' police to start acting? I mean, we've got all these people, private people, who have to disrupt these things. At what point did you experience in the past that the police would actually start arresting these people and do their own frickin' work that we pay them for?
They don't. The first step they do when they're under the gun is not to actually help us. They stand back. And a classic example of that is when we were occupying churches in Vancouver, we went into the largest Catholic cathedral. And when the police showed up, I handed them a copy of Crimen Solicitatis and a stand down order. I say, if you stop this peaceful protest at a taxpayer subsidized public institution like this, you're a complicit in a crime because you're helping them enforce this policy. So they took it away and looked at it, and then they went away, which is unusual because the police and the Knights of Columbus were usually surrounding the church, protecting the place. They stood down. And I've encountered that again and again, that when you educate these people and you see that we're standing on the law, I mean, cops aren't stupid. They see the corruption, like I talked to a Vancouver cop once who said, yeah, I know all about what he calls it, the hooker game. These cops grab prostitutes, drug them, film them, rape them, create their own little snuff films. And not many cops do it, but the rest know about it, but they don't. They have this loyalty thing where they can't rat each other out, but it doesn't sit well with them. And I think that's true about anybody in the system who's honest. We have to reach that. And eventually you reach a critical mass and they will first stand back and then actively join us. And I don't doubt that that's going to happen one day. We just have to, it's like anything. You got to be courageous and persistent. Absolutely. That's all you need.
Actually, now that you mention it, I have heard the stand down effect over and over. I can give you two examples. I had a victim recently who I can't name, but he said that he was harassed by the cops and he has evidence about being heavily implanted. And at some point, the cops said to him, look, we're not going to act against you anymore. That's it. We're out of the game. And he was basically being told, just leave us the hell alone, do your thing, but just don't involve us. The other example is that here in Switzerland, it's more to do with the courts. And one of the things that I found is that, for example, Gerhard Ulrich, a very famous Swiss anti-corruption campaigner over here in Europe, he had court action against him that has now charged him with I don't know how many days in prison. And it just keeps mounting from 100 days to 120 days. And what they started doing is nominally accrue the days he has to sit in prison and never actually enforce it. They just forget about it. They have the court case, they have the show trial, and they say, yes, we will put you in jail for 100 days. And then you never hear about them ever again.
Right. You never know the sympathy you have from people, right? In the system. And stubborn, you got to be stubborn. When I say courageous, people think, oh, I'm not courageous, but you can be stubborn.
I think that's what we mean, right?
All about it, yeah. So
absolutely. Okay, so this is great news. So what is the next big date in your calendar, coming up?
Well, it's there's stuff like I mentioned at the United Nations, July 1st.
That's the next date.
Mm-hmm. And there's going to be rallies there and attempts to lobby UN officials directly to start the process of nullifying the UN status, the status of the Vatican at the UN. During the summer, I'm planning, there's that big event in Vancouver where we're going to actually bring in common law sheriffs and attempt to make citizen arrests against the top Anglican and Catholic officials at this thing. Try to stop the Ninth Circle ceremony scheduled for July 16th at midnight. And hopefully by about August, winging my way over to Europe to carry on the same process there. But there's other people. There's lots of people around who are going to be assisting in that. So it's really, to be honest, Catherine, and there's too much to even mention. I mean, there's a lot of local things going on. And it's really, I see brush fires lit all over the place now.
Yeah. I think
this
is beautiful. I think, what your hard work over all this time has now paid off. And this is when you can just light bushfires, that's when it really pays off. So I guess for people to get moving right now, the next step would be right after this broadcast to look up who the officials are in the UN and start, I guess, blasting them with emails saying you have to remove the Vatican because we really had enough. Right.
And I would ask, exactly. And I would also ask them to send a copy to itccsoffice@gmail.com because they're coordinating the campaign and, they need that support to extend our network. So.
Absolutely. The other thing that I also want to get people to start doing is when you email these officers, don't just send the email and just leave it like that. Send the email, print it off as PDF because it is actually an official document. Right. And I think it can also be used in court. When we can prove that so many emails have been sent to the UN asking them to remove a transnational criminal organization from their board and it hasn't been answered, I think, after a very short time afterwards, after the next vote, we can start enforcing criminal action against the UN for aiding and abetting this criminality.
Exactly. Yes. Good point.
Okay. Let's get, guys, I'm talking to you here, the audience, don't just sit there and listen and then just switch off YouTube and go back to what you're doing. Send an email. And first of all, I think it's an educational exercise to find out who to send the email to, because right off, off the bat, I wouldn't even know who to contact. Do you have any ideas who, who exactly in the UN are we talking about that we should be contacting?
Well, it's ultimately it's the Security Council, and of course the UN Secretary General, and they have a press information office. I would suggest that the thing to do, if people want specific information about that, write to itccsoffice@gmail.com and ask them, because they're preparing a whole kind of media kit and information on who to go to and everything, so they can send that to anyone.
That would be great, because one of the things I would like to have to send to people, I get a lot of people who say to me after every broadcast, okay, we're hearing you, what should I do right now to help you? And sometimes donating money is the right thing. Sometimes sending an email for free is the right thing and actually much more powerful,
So they can, if they write to that email, then they can receive all that information. Yeah.
Okay, I think I will be one of the first people to actually do that. Thank you very much. And yes, is there anything that you would like to inform the viewers about before we finish?
I think we've said a lot of it, but I'm always appreciative of being on your show because you know a lot. You've been through the ringer yourself, and you're still there. You're still fighting, and we just have to keep holding that example up. Lead by example all the time. And thank you, for everything you do as well, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much. That's too kind. I also would like to, encourage everybody who's listening, because I think they don't realize that. I don't know about you, Kevin, but I just kind of fell into this. I never intended to be out on YouTube and do all this. I never intended to take on MI6 and the CIA and the Vatican. I was forced to do this. And I think what most people don't see is that once you get going, every one particular step looking back seems so small. So anybody can do it. You just have to keep taking one step after the other. And I wish more people would just get going from the position that they have and realize that if you're not targeted, you can achieve so much more because you have so much more energy in the day and so much more time. And just get going, guys, and help us, please. I think this is what I would like to say to them, right?
How humanity once believed that that they were the center of the universe, the sun, and then the Copernican revolution, suddenly we realize, no, it's a lot more, we're not the center of the universe anymore. And people need to evolve that way in their own life, that my concern about myself is not the issue anymore. It's got to be seen in a bigger context of what is at stake if we don't take this action. Our survival as a species. our children's lives, our liberties, our own control of our own minds. That's what's at risk. So once you can activate that, you can't stop people, but you need to spark that first. And so we just have to keep at it doing that.
Thank you, Kevin. I think these are the perfect finishing words. And with that, I would like to, absolutely perfect. I couldn't have put it any better. So thank you very much for being on the show. And thank you to the viewers for having listened to us. And tune in again for the next interview, because this is an ongoing genocide. This is ongoing cases. And yes, get writing, write the email. Can you say the email one more time? What they should...
The ITCCS office at gmail.com.
And ITCCS office is all one word at gmail.com.
ITCCS office at gmail.com. Yeah.
Perfect. So guys, send the email tonight. Don't just sit there and, watch us eating your peanuts. So send the email, get the information, and make a, to-do list that you will help us, because there are real lives at stake. There are real people being tortured. And the detention facility where Kevin was taken, apparently there are still people we don't know about who are being held there and probably tortured and experimented on. And we need to find out where that place was, who these people are, and we need to get them the hell out of there. Okay, yes. That's what I would say. So thank you for listening, and bye for now. Get going, guys. Do the action. So bye for now.